Good Night with Jesus, a calming bedtime story of peace and love. In this calming bedtime story, we'll journey to the shores of ancient Galilee where the setting sun bathes the landscape in amber and gold. Through the eyes of a weary traveler seeking rest, you'll encounter Jesus' gentle teachings designed to quiet your mind and prepare your spirit for deep, restorative sleep. These timeless words speak directly to your heart, creating the perfect sanctuary for peaceful slumber. The weary soul, meeting our contemporary character. What if the ancient teachings of Jesus could reach across time to comfort you tonight? Across the centuries, wisdom meant for troubled hearts still offers sanctuary to those who cannot find rest. For Ruth Wilson, this possibility wasn't merely theoretical, it had become an urgent need. Ruth, a 38-year-old hospital administrator, stared at her bedroom ceiling, watching shadows dance across the textured surface. The digital clock on her nightstand cast a harsh blue glow, 11:47 p.m. Another night of inevitable tossing and turning stretched before her like an unwelcome journey. She exhaled slowly, feeling the familiar tightness in her chest, the physical manifestation of anxieties that refused to be silenced by nightfall. The day's concerns had followed her home like persistent shadows. Budget cuts at the hospital, her aging mother's health, and the looming mortgage payment each multiplied in the darkness, defying resolution. Her body ached with the peculiar exhaustion that comes not from physical exertion but from carrying emotional burdens too heavy for too long. Not again, she whispered to the empty room, pressing her palms against her tired eyes. Sleep had become elusive, transforming from natural necessity into something she pursued yet could not capture. Ruth had tried everything: meditation apps, breathing techniques, herbal supplements, even prescription medications that left her groggy yet somehow still conscious. Ruth's relationship with faith had evolved through the years, resembling the ebb and flow of an inconstant tide. Raised in a devout Methodist household, she had attended Sunday school faithfully as a child, finding comfort in the stories of Jesus calming storms and healing the broken. Though she had drifted from regular church attendance in her 30s, fragments of those early teachings remained. On difficult nights, she found herself remembering scripture passages, echoes of comfort from a faith that had once seemed so straightforward. With practiced movements, Ruth began her bedtime ritual, not from anticipation of rest, but from the disciplined hope that routine might eventually invite sleep. She dimmed her bedroom lamp to a soft amber glow that transformed the space into a warm sanctuary. The familiar objects around her, framed photographs, the watercolor from Maine, half-read books, took on gentler contours in the subdued light. From her nightstand drawer, she withdrew the small Bible her grandmother had given her for her confirmation, its leather cover softened by years of handling, its pages marked with faded highlighter and various notations that chronicled her spiritual journey. Like a traveler seeking an ancient map, she hadn't opened it for months, but tonight she felt drawn to its weathered promise of comfort. Ruth's fingers found Psalm 23 without conscious thought, her childhood memory guiding her to those ancient words of a shepherd's care. "The Lord is my shepherd, I shall not want." She read softly, allowing the familiar cadence to wash over her. The poetic assurance of green pastures and still waters stood in stark contrast to her internal landscape of anxiety and restlessness. Setting the Bible aside, she switched off the lamp and settled against her pillows. In the darkness, she whispered the prayer that had become her nightly petition: "Please, just let me sleep. Just a few hours of peace." The simplicity of the request belied its profound importance. Sleep had become more than physical necessity, it represented a temporary escape from worry. Minutes passed as Ruth focused on her breathing, in for 4 counts, hold for 7, out for 8. Gradually, her racing thoughts began to slow. The tension in her shoulders eased incrementally. The sounds of her apartment building seemed to recede, as if the world were gently withdrawing to give her space for rest. For the first time in weeks, Ruth felt the distinct shift in consciousness that precedes sleep, that curious sensation of simultaneously sinking and floating. Images began to form and dissolve behind her closed eyelids as her awareness drifted from wakefulness. As she descended towards sleep, Ruth noticed something unusual. The ambient sounds of her bedroom were changing. Her air conditioner's mechanical hum transformed, becoming rhythmic and organic, like water lapping against something solid. The faint traffic noise shifted, resembling distant human voices speaking in unfamiliar cadences. The very air around her changed texture, becoming warmer, less processed. Her senses detected unfamiliar scents, something vegetal and earthy, mixed with smoke and salt. The mattress beneath her seemed to change consistency, modern memory foam giving way to something less yielding. In the liminal space between sleeping and waking, Ruth experienced a peculiar awareness that she was transitioning not merely between consciousness states but between realities. Her analytical mind offered brief resistance, but the experience carried an authenticity that bypassed intellectual objection. With dreamlike logic that accepts the impossible, Ruth understood she was being drawn into a different time and place. Her modern bedroom was dissolving around her, its familiar boundaries becoming permeable. Through half-opened eyes that saw what physical sight could not, she perceived warm amber light replacing the cool darkness of her room. The solid walls seemed to disappear, opening to an expansive evening sky painted with colors no digital screen could replicate. As her consciousness completed its extraordinary transition, Ruth became aware that she was no longer in her apartment in the 21st century. The sensation was not frightening but rather filled with profound curiosity and unexpected peace. Something in her recognized this place she had never physically visited, the shores of ancient Galilee, where teachings that had traveled through millennia had first been spoken. Shores of ancient Galilee, a sensory awakening. The shores of ancient Galilee revealed themselves not as Ruth had imagined from Sunday school illustrations, but as a living, breathing world that engaged every sense with unexpected intensity. The historical landscape emerged around her with startling clarity, not as a static backdrop for biblical narratives, but as a vibrant reality with textures, aromas, and sounds that no historical account had adequately conveyed. Her consciousness, having traversed the boundaries of time, now anchored itself firmly in this unfamiliar yet profoundly recognizable setting. The disorientation came from overwhelming sensory input, as Ruth's modern perceptions confronted the unfiltered ancient world, a living canvas where each element shifted and breathed with authentic life. Her rational mind searched for explanations, a vivid dream, perhaps, or some neurological phenomenon, yet her senses reported with such precision that theoretical questions gradually subsided beneath the weight of immediate experience. Before her stretched the Sea of Galilee in evening light, its surface transformed into sheets of burnished copper where the setting sun touched the water. This body of water possessed character and vitality far beyond sanitized storybook images. Small waves lapped persistently at the shoreline, each catching the amber light differently, creating a constantly shifting mosaic of illumination. The water presented a complex palette of teal, amber, and deep shadow where depth changed. Fishing boats dotted the water, their wooden frames silhouetted against the evening sky as they returned homeward after a day's labor. These were handcrafted working vessels with patched sails now being lowered, their wooden hulls weathered by constant exposure to sun and water. Their movements created gentle disturbances in the water's surface, sending ripples outward in expanding circles that captured the fading light. The ambient soundscape enveloped Ruth in layers of unfamiliar yet fundamentally human activity. Conversations flowed in what she somehow recognized as Aramaic, not that she understood the words, but rather that her consciousness identified the ancient language that Jesus himself would have spoken. The cadence and tone carried across the water with surprising clarity, punctuated by laughter or calls between fishermen. Water birds circled overhead, their cries distinctive from the seagulls of modern coastlines. These sounds intermingled with the persistent creaking of wooden boats settling against crude moorings, a rhythmic groaning of wood against wood that spoke of technology limited to natural materials and human ingenuity. From nearby settlements came the distant sounds of evening activities, the rhythmic thudding of something being pounded, perhaps grain or spices, and occasional bleating of goats. The aromas of this ancient evening transported Ruth most powerfully. Wood smoke from cooking fires rose in thin columns from the shoreline settlements, carrying the distinctive smell of olive wood burning, sweeter and more pungent than the pine fires she had known in her youth. This bass note mingled with the smell of fresh fish being prepared and the comforting scent of bread baking, its yeasty warmth a human constant recognizable across millennia. Underlying these specifics was something more fundamental that Ruth could only identify as the smell of the ancient world itself. Earth unpaved, fabrics woven by hand, bodies washed in lake water. Ruth became aware of the texture beneath her feet, coarser shore material interspersed with small pebbles and occasional fragments of shell. The evening breeze coming off the water carried a gentle moisture that settled on her skin, neither cool nor warm but perfectly matched to human comfort as the day's heat dissipated. This breeze stirred her clothing, reminding her of her physical presence in this extraordinary moment. Her appearance had somehow adjusted to this environment. Her modern sleepwear had been replaced by simple garments of undyed cloth, a long tunic and shawl-like outer covering. The natural fibers felt heavier than the synthetic materials she was accustomed to, yet fundamentally comfortable in their drape and weight. Her feet were clad in simple leather sandals that left her ankles exposed to the evening air. As the sun descended below the western horizon, Ruth noticed a subtle shift in human activity along the shoreline. A gathering was forming, people moving with apparent purpose toward a particular section of the shore. Unlike the purposeful industry of returning fishermen, this movement possessed a quality of anticipation rather than conclusion. People walked alone or in small groups, converging gradually like streams joining to form a river. The crowd was modest, perhaps 50 or 60 individuals, but their focused movement created an unmistakable current of human attention. Without conscious decision, Ruth found herself drawn in their direction, her feet carrying her along the lakeshore path. The tension between her modern identity and this ancient reality began to dissolve as curiosity overcame analytical thought. Something significant was about to occur, and some part of her recognized its importance. As she walked, Ruth realized that despite the extraordinary nature of her situation, she felt none of the anxiety that had plagued her contemporary life. The pressing concerns that had kept her awake night after night seemed to belong to another person in another world. Here, the immediacy of sensory experience had displaced abstract worry. The physical reality of sand underfoot, wind against skin, and the sounds of human activity anchored her consciousness firmly in the present moment. The gathering crowd now drew her forward with gentle but irresistible attraction. Though she remained aware of her status as an outsider, Ruth felt no hesitation in joining them. Whatever was about to happen at that section of shoreline seemed to involve her as well, despite the vast gulf of time and culture that separated her from these first-century Galileans. She followed, feeling both profoundly curious and inexplicably at peace. The gathering crowd, anticipation by the water. Among these strangers gathered by Galilean waters, Ruth discovered a paradox that challenged her modern understanding of community. Though lacking technological connections, these people possessed a fundamental togetherness that transcended her world of digital isolation. Their anticipatory silence spoke of souls prepared to receive transformative wisdom in the approaching night. As she moved deeper into the gathering, Ruth observed the remarkable diversity of those assembled. Fishermen with skin burnished by years under the Galilean sun positioned themselves beside merchants in modest yet carefully maintained garments. Women of varying ages attended to sleeping infants or quietly supervised children. Elderly men with deeply lined faces leaned on hand-carved staffs, their postures bearing the weight of decades while their eyes remained alight with expectation. Ruth found herself studying their countenances with newfound perception. A young mother's face reflected bone-deep exhaustion yet remained illuminated with tenacious hope. A fisherman's weathered hands, cracked and calloused, trembled slightly. An elderly woman's eyes carried the quiet dignity that comes through surviving profound suffering, containing only expectant serenity rather than bitterness. Moving carefully through the assembly, Ruth began to discern fragments of hushed conversations in Aramaic. The universal language of human concern transcended linguistic barriers. Laborers spoke in low tones about harvest yields and family sustenance. Women exchanged whispers while nodding toward distant Roman soldiers, their expressions reflecting the complex negotiation of life under occupation. Most striking to Ruth were the occasional mentions she could interpret, Messiah, and kingdom, whispered with a mixture of caution and yearning. These represented desperate hopes for tangible deliverance from concrete hardships, Roman taxation, the indignities of foreign rule, the struggle for daily bread, all converging in their collective anticipation of transformation. The gathering organized itself with natural, unspoken coordination, like tributaries flowing effortlessly into a river. Without apparent direction, the crowd formed a perfect semicircle facing the water, leaving an open space at the shore's edge through communal intuition. This spontaneous arrangement created a natural amphitheater, with the gentle slope of the beach serving as tiered seating. The positioning preserved clear sight lines to the water where attention would eventually focus. Ruth observed how the community cared for its vulnerable members without fanfare. Young men helped elderly neighbors settle comfortably on flat rocks. A mother with multiple children accepted assistance from another woman who had none, making childcare a shared responsibility. Children who had been running along the shoreline now quieted and returned to their parents, sensing the gathering solemnity of the moment. This implicit social order reflected none of the isolation Ruth recognized from her contemporary world. No one sat apart, absorbed in private distraction. No artificial barriers separated individuals from the collective experience. The absence of familiar technologies, no screens, no headphones, no digital interruptions, allowed for a quality of presence she found both foreign and profoundly moving. As Ruth watched the flowing movements of people finding their places, she felt herself becoming part of this living organism, no longer merely an observer but gradually being woven into the communal fabric. The simple acts of sharing further illuminated this communal ethic. A family distributed portions of flatbread far beyond their immediate circle. An earthenware jug passed from hand to hand, each person taking a modest sip before passing it onward. These were not extraordinary acts but the expected fabric of their shared existence, the natural expression of interdependence in a world where survival depended on mutual care. Ruth accepted a small piece of offered bread, its rough texture and subtle sourdough flavor unlike anything from her modern bakeries. The simple food connected her physically to this moment, these people. As she ate, she realized how rarely she shared unmediated meals with others in her contemporary life, how seldom she broke bread without the buffer of restaurants, delivery services, or microwaves. As twilight deepened into dusk, a gradual quieting fell over the assembly. Conversations ceased, children were gently hushed, and a collective attentiveness descended upon the gathering. Ruth followed their gaze toward the darkening waters of the Sea of Galilee, where a small fishing vessel appeared, moving steadily toward shore. Though unremarkable in itself, the boat commanded extraordinary collective focus. The silence that enveloped the crowd now held a quality Ruth struggled to define. It was neither the awkward silence of her hospital board meetings nor the distracted silence of her commuter train, but an expectant silence, pregnant with anticipation yet entirely peaceful, the silence of souls prepared to receive rather than demand. In her world of constant noise and stimulation, Ruth recognized how rarely she experienced such complete attentiveness, such unified purpose. The faces around her transformed subtly as the boat drew nearer. Worry lines relaxed, shoulders lowered, breathing deepened. Whatever burdens these people carried, Roman occupation, physical ailments, economic hardship, personal grief, seemed temporarily suspended in this moment of collective hope. Ruth found herself inexplicably sharing in this anticipation, her own modern anxieties momentarily forgotten as she, too, watched the approaching vessel with growing wonder. Though the figure in the boat remained indistinct in the gathering darkness, Ruth experienced a sudden quickening of her heart, an innate recognition that transcended visual confirmation. Something within her, beyond intellect, beyond the boundaries of her 21st century consciousness, knew with absolute certainty who approached. This recognition came not as information processed but as knowledge remembered, as though some ancient part of her soul had always been waiting for this moment. The first encounter, Jesus steps ashore. The distance between divinity and humanity collapsed in a single moment as the boat's wooden hull scraped gently against the shore's pebbled edge. Ruth stood transfixed, her breath suspended in her lungs as if the air itself recognized the significance of this encounter. The figure in the boat rose with a fluid economy of movement, requiring no dramatic gestures to command the attention of every person gathered along the shoreline. In that moment, Ruth experienced what theologians have contemplated for centuries, the profound psychological impact of beholding the face of Jesus in person. As he stepped from the boat onto the shore, Ruth confronted the most disorienting realization of her dreamscape journey. The man now standing before the crowd bore no resemblance to the paintings that had adorned her childhood church. Rather than the flowing blonde hair and pale European features of artistic tradition, she beheld a man of average height with the sturdy build of someone accustomed to physical labor. His skin held the deep, rich brown tones of a Middle Eastern tradesman who had spent decades under the Galilean sun. His beard was full but neatly trimmed, and his dark, curly hair was cut relatively short, practical rather than ceremonial. His clothing reflected nothing of royalty, simple homespun wool in earth tones, a humble tunic belted at the waist, and sandals showing signs of extensive use. Yet despite this disparity with artistic renderings, Ruth's heart recognized him with absolute certainty. She understood that divine presence manifested not through physical beauty as defined by Renaissance artists, but through an ineffable quality that emanated from his entire being. This authentic ordinariness embodied the theological concept of kenosis, divine self-emptying, that Ruth had studied but never fully comprehended until this moment. His eyes, deep-set under a prominent brow, possessed a quality that defied Ruth's academic vocabulary. They held both infinite compassion and unsettling perceptiveness, capable of perceiving not merely one's actions but the complicated matrix of intentions and hopes behind them. They saw everything about you yet withheld judgment, perceiving both what you were and what you could become. This embodied humility, so contrary to worldly power, became the vessel through which his profound impact flowed. As Jesus surveyed the gathering, Ruth felt herself physically respond, her shoulders relaxing, her breathing deepening. Similar reactions rippled through the crowd, a fussing child quieted, an elderly man's pained expression softened, and the collective anxiety began to dissipate like morning mist under gentle sun. When he spoke, his voice surprised her with its natural clarity rather than theatrical projection. His greeting, "Shalom Aleichem," emerged like a stream over smooth stones. In the momentary silence that followed, Ruth felt the words settle within her, not merely as sound but as tangible presence. Though pitched perfectly to carry across the assembly, it contained an intimacy that made Ruth feel addressed personally. The Hebrew phrase transformed from social convention to profound benediction. Each person appeared to receive this greeting in uniquely personal ways. The young mother clutched her infant closer, as if the words had wrapped around them protectively. The fisherman with trembling hands momentarily steadied. The calculating merchants displayed expressions suggesting the sudden irrelevance of profit concerns. Each heard exactly what their soul most needed. With open palms extended briefly outward, Jesus indicated a natural rise in the shoreline that would serve as his seat. The gesture contained neither flourish nor command, yet possessed a quiet authority that transformed the shore into a natural amphitheater. As he seated himself, the assembly adjusted, some drawing closer, others settling more comfortably. "Be at ease," he said in Aramaic, the everyday language of the region. Ruth understood him perfectly despite the linguistic distance of centuries. As he spoke, he made a gentle, inclusive gesture that simultaneously invited closeness and granted permission to remain where one was comfortable. Ruth found herself drawing nearer, moving through the crowd with a sense of gravitational pull. Though she had questioned religious authority throughout her adult life, she now experienced no resistance or skepticism. There was only a profound sense of recognition, not merely recognizing Jesus, but experiencing what it meant to be fully recognized herself. This encounter activated something fundamental in human psychology, the deep longing to be truly seen, fully known, and unconditionally accepted. The distance between them narrowed until Ruth found herself perhaps 15 feet from where he sat. She could now discern subtle details, the calluses on his hands, the wear patterns on his garments, the slight asymmetry of his features that marked him as genuinely human rather than an idealized archetype. A smile formed at the edges of his mouth as his gaze met hers directly, and Ruth experienced what mystics throughout the centuries had attempted to articulate, the sensation of being fully known yet fully loved. In his presence, the categories that had structured Ruth's understanding, sacred and secular, ancient and modern, physical and spiritual, dissolved into a unified perception. The artificial barriers between these realms revealed themselves as constructs of limited consciousness rather than reflections of reality. She understood that what separated her contemporary world from this ancient one was primarily a fundamental fragmentation of human experience. As Jesus began to speak again, Ruth became aware that his communication transcended mere verbal content. His cadence, expressions, and measured pauses conveyed meaning as surely as his words, a multidimensional language engaging all aspects of human perception. The parable of the Good Shepherd, finding security in divine care. As twilight descended upon the gathering, Jesus' voice took on a different quality, no longer merely addressing their minds but reaching towards something more primal within each listener. The ancient fear of darkness, of being vulnerable and unseen, hung in the air as shadows lengthened across the shore. In this liminal space between day and night, Jesus began to weave a narrative that would transform these universal anxieties into profound reassurance. When evening comes, Jesus began, his voice carrying effortlessly across the assembly without strain, the shepherd calls his sheep from their scattered grazing. He gestured toward the distant hillsides where, Ruth realized, actual shepherds would soon be gathering their flocks for the night. This wasn't abstract theology but immediate reality to his listeners. Ruth recognized the beginning of the Good Shepherd parable, a text she had encountered numerous times throughout her life. Yet something extraordinary was happening. The familiar words were dissolving into direct experience. The intellectual distance between story and reality collapsed entirely. The shepherd stands at the entrance to the sheepfold, Jesus continued, and calls each one by name. As he spoke, his right hand extended slightly, mimicking the gentle beckoning motion a shepherd might use. They know his voice, the particular timbre, the unique cadence that belongs to him alone. Ruth observed how this detail resonated with the gathering. Several nodded in understanding. They had witnessed this daily phenomenon throughout their lives. The relationship between shepherd and sheep was practical, necessary, and intensely personal. When darkness falls, Jesus said, his voice deepening with the growing shadows around them, predators emerge from their hiding places. Wolves, jackals, lions, they circle the vulnerable. His description created a palpable tension. Ruth found herself instinctively glancing toward the surrounding wilderness. Jesus described the sheepfold in precise detail, a sanctuary constructed with intention. The limestone walls rose chest-high, carefully stacked without mortar by generations of shepherds. The single entrance remained the sole vulnerability, a necessary passage that could become a point of danger. And what does the shepherd do as night descends completely? Jesus asked, allowing silence to expand the question. He becomes the gate itself, his body positioned across the only entrance, creating a living barrier between his flock and danger. The image settled upon the gathering with extraordinary weight. Any predator would encounter the shepherd before reaching a single sheep. Any sheep attempting to wander would need to step over the shepherd's form. The sheep rest in perfect peace, Jesus said, because the one who knows them completely has placed himself between them and all harm. Ruth felt something release within her chest, a bodily recognition of safety. The constant anxieties that had accompanied her seemed suddenly external to her essential self, separated by an invisible but impenetrable boundary. Jesus then shifted the narrative, describing a shepherd counting his flock as they entered the nighttime enclosure. 97, 98, 99, he counted slowly, his eyes moving as though tracking actual sheep entering an invisible fold. Then his expression changed, brow furrowing, eyes scanning the horizon where the last light illuminated distant shapes. One is missing, he said simply. The gathering grew unusually still. Even the lapping waters of the lake seemed to quiet. Ruth felt the collective tension. A lost sheep represented potential catastrophe for families surviving on minimal resources. What does the shepherd do? Jesus asked, allowing the question to linger. Having secured 99, does he consider this acceptable? A reasonable loss against the ledger of profit and risk? The question invited each listener to consider their own calculations of acceptable loss. What, or who, might be considered expendable in their own mental accounting? No, Jesus said with quiet certainty. He secures the 99 and then returns to the darkness. He retraces each path where the lost one might have wandered. He calls with increasing urgency, listening for the faintest response. As Jesus spoke, his hands traced invisible paths through the air, his head turning slightly as though listening for distant sounds. The shepherd's determination became embodied in these subtle movements, transforming abstract concepts into visible commitment. And when he finds the one who has strayed, Jesus continued, his voice warming, he does not drive it back with threats or punishment. He lifts it onto his shoulders. Here Jesus raised his hands, demonstrating the gentle strength required. The very one who wandered now rests closest to the shepherd's heart during the journey home. Ruth noticed tears forming in several eyes around her. The concept of being sought with such persistence spoke to something fundamental in human experience, the fear of being forgotten or deemed unworthy of effort. Jesus' voice grew softer, requiring each listener to lean forward. Which of you, having 100 coins and losing one, does not light a lamp and sweep the house, searching carefully until it is found. Ruth's mind filled with startling clarity, she could perceive the shepherd's determined search and profound relief upon discovery. In this imagery, she recognized her own spiritual wanderings, times when she too had somehow been found and returned. There is more rejoicing over one that was lost and is found, Jesus concluded, than over 99 that never wandered. This inversion of expected values contained a radical proposition about worth and belonging. As Jesus fell silent, Ruth became aware of a transformation within herself. The persistent background hum of threat had been replaced by profound containment within protective boundaries. Her consciousness expanded beyond mere survival, allowing her to comprehend the spiritual landscape with newfound clarity and peace. The lilies of the field, releasing tomorrow's worries. With Ruth's vigilance systems now calmed, a deeper layer of consciousness expanded within her. The wildflowers along the shoreline began closing their delicate petals as twilight deepened into evening, a subtle movement that might have gone unnoticed in her previous state of hypervigilance. Jesus, with his remarkable attunement to both natural rhythms and human concerns, gestured toward these simple blooms with an open palm. "Consider these wildflowers," he said, his voice carrying easily across the gathered crowd despite its gentleness. "They have been closing themselves for the night since time immemorial, without anxiety about tomorrow's sunrise." Ruth observed the faces around her, illuminated now by the first stars appearing in the darkening sky and the few oil lamps being kindled within the gathering. She recognized in their expressions the same anxieties about future uncertainties that had kept her awake for countless nights. A merchant's furrowed brow betrayed concerns about tomorrow's transactions. A farmer's tightened jaw revealed worry about the coming harvest. "Look at these lilies growing along the shore," Jesus continued, kneeling to touch one of the wildflowers with careful fingers. The velvety texture of the petal under his touch seemed to embody the very softness that anxiety steals from human experience. "They neither labor nor spin, yet I tell you that not even Solomon in all his splendor was dressed like one of these." The reference to King Solomon, legendary for his wealth and wisdom, caused subtle shifts in posture among the listeners. Several people leaned forward, their attention sharpened by this unexpected comparison between royal opulence and common wildflowers. "If God so clothes the grass of the field, which is here today and tomorrow is thrown into the fire, will he not much more clothe you?" Jesus asked, rising to his feet again. His question hung in the air, genuinely inviting contemplation. An elderly man seated near Ruth exhaled audibly, his weathered hands relaxing in his lap as if surrendering to the same natural rhythm as the closing flowers. Jesus continued with gentle humor, "Who among you, by worrying, has added a single hour to your life? Or a single cubit to your height?" A ripple of laughter moved through the gathering, quiet at first, then more confident. Ruth found herself smiling, recognizing the absurdity of her sleepless nights spent recalculating figures that remained stubbornly unchanged by her anxious arithmetic. "The birds of the air neither sow nor reap nor gather into barns," Jesus said, gesturing toward a night heron gliding silently over the darkening water, "yet your heavenly Father feeds them. Are you not of more value than they?" Each person responded differently to these words. A young fisherman nodded vigorously. An older woman quietly wiped away a tear. A middle-aged carpenter studied his calloused hands thoughtfully. "Tomorrow will worry about itself," Jesus stated with directness. "Each day has enough trouble of its own." Ruth pondered how these teachings might apply to her contemporary challenges: budget spreadsheets, staff reductions, mother's medical appointments. Jesus didn't suggest difficulties would vanish but offered a fundamentally different approach to facing them, one that would soon transform her relationship with uncertainty itself. Across the gathering, physical tensions visibly released. Shoulders lowered from protective hunches. Furrowed brows smoothed. Clenched jaws relaxed. An elderly woman near Jesus actually fell asleep, her head nodding gently forward before being caught by a younger woman beside her who simply adjusted her position to provide better support. "Therefore I tell you," Jesus continued, his voice taking on a more intimate quality, "do not worry about your life, what you will eat or drink, or about your body, what you will wear. Is not life more than food, and the body more than clothes?" The teaching shifted from identifying anxiety to articulating an alternative. "Seek first the kingdom of God," Jesus said, "and all these things will be given to you as well." Ruth noticed how Jesus employed concrete examples and abstract principles. The lilies, the birds, Solomon's finery, these tangible references anchored his profound statements about divine care in immediately accessible experience. The evening breeze carried both his words and the scent of water and earth, connecting his teaching to the sensory reality of their surroundings. "Your Father knows what you need before you ask him," Jesus said softly, his gaze seemingly finding each person individually. When his eyes met Ruth's, she experienced a moment of stunning recognition. He knew precisely which spreadsheets had kept her awake, which difficult conversations loomed, which medical decisions weighed most heavily on her heart. "Where your treasure is, there your heart will be also," Jesus said, his voice barely above a whisper yet perfectly audible. "You cannot serve both God and wealth." A wealthy merchant nodded slowly, perhaps recognizing how anxieties about maintaining his position had prevented him from experiencing the security he sought through acquisition. As Jesus spoke about worry, its mechanics, its futility, its alternatives, Ruth experienced a profound cognitive restructuring. Her perception shifted from seeing herself as the ultimate source of provision to recognizing herself as situated within a larger economy of care. "Give your entire attention to what God is doing right now," Jesus said, "and don't get worked up about what may or may not happen tomorrow." Ruth felt layers of complex anxiety dissolving through a radical reordering of priorities. Her responsibilities remained unchanged, yet these realities no longer dominated her consciousness as ultimate concerns. A small child who had been fidgeting throughout now climbed contentedly into his mother's lap, nestling against her shoulder with heavy eyelids. His surrender to sleep embodied the very trust Jesus described, a releasing of vigilance into the care of one greater. As night settled fully over the gathering, Ruth experienced a sensation she hadn't known in months, the weight of tomorrow's uncertainties lifting from her shoulders, not because they had been resolved but because they had been properly situated within a larger framework of meaning and care. The Father's love, comfort for the lonely heart. While Ruth had found release from her anxieties about the future, as darkness enveloped the hillside, several listeners unconsciously drew closer to one another, their bodies revealing a deeper human need that transcends material concerns. In the stillness between Jesus' words, the question of loneliness, that peculiar ache that intensifies when daylight fades, awaited his address. The stars emerged like scattered diamonds across the deepening indigo canvas of the Galilean sky, casting a silvery light that transformed the landscape into something otherworldly yet intimately familiar. The moon rose higher now, its reflection creating a shimmering pathway across the water's surface. As darkness descended, Ruth noticed the assembly's collective posture shift. The space between individuals contracted, families moved inward, and those who had stood alone found places among others. This wordless choreography expressed a fundamental truth: human hearts seek connection when shadows lengthen. Jesus' voice adapted to this transformation, becoming lower and more intimate. He spoke now as one sharing sacred confidences rather than proclaiming to distant listeners. Ruth found herself drawn forward by the gravity of his words. "Consider the sparrows," Jesus said, indicating a bird taking final flight before nightfall. 5 are sold for 2 pennies, yet not one is forgotten by God. Indeed, the very hairs of your head are all numbered. Don't be afraid, you are worth more than many sparrows." His gaze moved deliberately across the assembly, making each individual feel singularly seen while simultaneously holding the entire gathering in awareness. "There was a certain man who had 2 sons. The familiar opening of the parable rippled through the crowd. Jesus described the younger son demanding his inheritance prematurely, his journey to a distant country, his squandering of wealth, and his eventual decision to return home, hoping merely to be hired as a servant. When Jesus portrayed the father, his voice carried profound emotion. While he was still a long way off, his father saw him and was filled with compassion. Jesus extended his arms, demonstrating with his whole body. The father ran to his son, threw his arms around him and kissed him. The words hung in the air, resonant with the sound of running feet and tears falling upon a prodigal's shoulder. "Suppose one of you has a child who wakes frightened in the night," Jesus said, bridging from the parable to immediate experience. "Do you hesitate before offering comfort? No, even before they call, you are already moving toward them. Ruth considered how Jesus specifically addressed nighttime fears, those particular terrors that emerge when darkness makes the mind feel most isolated. She recognized her own sleepless hours, when anxieties multiplied unchecked by daylight's rational boundaries. When a child fears monsters in shadows, what does a loving parent do? Jesus continued softly. They don't merely call from another room. They come and sit beside the child. They bring light. They remain present until fear subsides. This is what your Father in heaven does. Not a distant deity watching from afar, but Abba. The Aramaic term conveyed warmth, protection, and absolute trustworthiness. In the watches of the night, when loneliness weighs heaviest, when you feel most separate from all living things, remember, you are not alone. The very darkness that seems to isolate you is where Abba draws nearest. Ruth watched transformation move through those around her. An elderly woman wiped silent tears. A distant teenage boy edged closer to those beside him. The solitude that often pervades crowds dissipated, replaced by genuine communion. Each of you knows loneliness that others cannot see, Jesus acknowledged. Even surrounded by family, even in marriage, even among friends, there remain in every human heart chambers that seem unreachable. This separation is not the final truth about you, Jesus continued. It is merely the limitation of human perception. You are never alone because you are never out of the Father's awareness. Gesturing toward the night sky, he said, consider how each star appears isolated in vast darkness. From their perspective, they might believe themselves utterly alone. Yet the same forces that hold them in place connect them across immeasurable distances. So it is with you. What seems like isolation is merely the inability to perceive the invisible bonds that connect all living things in the Father's care. When you lie down to sleep, imagine yourself held in Abba's hand. Not as concept but as living truth. The darkness around your bed is not empty space but the very presence of God, closer than your next breath, more intimate than your own thoughts. His voice took on a rhythmic quality reminiscent of a lullaby. As a mother comforts her child, so will I comfort you. When you lie down, you will not be afraid, your sleep will be sweet. Ruth experienced something extraordinary. The profound aloneness that had characterized much of her adult life began to dissolve through a fundamental shift in perception. What if loneliness was not an existential truth but merely a limited perception? What if connection constituted a deeper reality than separation? For the first time, Ruth understood that darkness wasn't empty space but presence itself, the recognition that even in her most isolated moments, she was encompassed by awareness that knew her completely yet loved her unconditionally. The peace that passes understanding, calming the troubled mind. The comfort of never being truly alone had settled upon Ruth like a warm blanket, yet she noticed several in the gathering still bore the unmistakable countenance of inner turmoil. What manner of peace could possibly quiet the racing thoughts that had carved permanent furrows between their brows, thoughts that neither the assurance of divine presence nor human companionship seemed capable of silencing? Night had fully descended upon the Galilean hillside. The moon, nearly full, cast silver light across the water, and a few oil lamps flickered among the assembly, creating pools of amber warmth in the darkness. The transformation from twilight to true night seemed to mirror a shifting in Jesus' teaching, from external concerns to the deeper territories of the human heart. Ruth observed those around her, a woman with tense posture, an older man bearing signs of persistent mental fatigue. These were souls battling interior storms that continued even when external circumstances were calm. Jesus' voice took on a different quality now, gentle yet penetrating. You have heard it said that peace means the absence of conflict, he began, the cessation of struggle or the elimination of difficulty. He paused, his gaze sweeping across the assembly. But I give you peace that differs from what the world offers. Not the removal of storms, but stability within them. The semantic distinction seemed profoundly important, Ruth realized. The peace Jesus described wasn't contingent upon favorable circumstances or the resolution of difficulties. It represented an internal state that could exist independently of external conditions, precisely the state that had eluded her through countless sleepless nights. Consider the depths of the sea, Jesus continued, gesturing toward the dark waters before them. On the surface, waves crash and winds create turmoil. Yet descend below, to the deep places, and there you find stillness untouched by the tempest above. This is the peace I offer you, not the elimination of surface storms, but access to depths they cannot disturb. The metaphor resonated among the gathering. Ruth noticed a collective easing of tension, as if the assembly were beginning to comprehend this distinctive form of peace. The troubled mind, Jesus said, is like a vessel overloaded with cargo meant for other ships to carry. He stretched out his hands, palms upward in invitation. Come to me, all who are heavy laden, and I will give you rest. My yoke is easy, and my burden is light. Ruth considered how this ancient wisdom aligned with what she understood of the mind's functioning. Modern understanding recognized how the brain could become overwhelmed, exactly what Jesus addressed in speaking of burdens not meant for human shoulders to carry alone. Jesus now moved among the gathering, his voice lowering to intimate counsel. Many of you lie awake replaying old words, revisiting old wounds, rehearsing old failures. But understand this, forgiveness is not merely something you extend to others, it is something you must accept for yourself. He stopped beside a middle-aged man whose face bore the marks of shame. Your Father has removed your transgressions as far as the east is from the west. Why do you continually journey to retrieve what he has discarded? The man began to weep silently. Ruth found herself confronting her own cycles of self-recrimination, the mental flagellation over past decisions, failed relationships, missed opportunities. This exhausting pattern had become so familiar she hardly recognized its relentless drain on her mental resources. The mind that cannot rest, Jesus continued, is often a mind that refuses to practice forgiveness, toward others, yes, but equally toward oneself. He paused then, and to Ruth's surprise, simply sat down cross-legged on the sand. For several moments, the gathering grew utterly still, with only the gentle lapping of water against the shore and soft breathing breaking the silence. Be still, he finally said, his voice barely above a whisper, and know that I am God. This invitation to stillness seemed paradoxically active, not emptiness but engaged receptivity. Ruth found herself allowing her awareness to rest in the present moment rather than darting anxiously between past and future. The mind given to constant activity, Jesus said after the shared silence, has forgotten its true purpose. It was designed not as a theater of endless performance but as a sanctuary of divine communion. This reframing struck Ruth forcefully. She had never considered that her cognitive faculties might have a deeper purpose than problem-solving or analyzing. The human mind engineered primarily for relationship with its creator represented a profound paradigm shift. Jesus began to speak words of blessing over the assembly. Peace I leave with you, my peace I give to you. Not as the world gives do I give to you. Let not your hearts be troubled, neither let them be afraid. As he spoke, Ruth noticed people gradually succumbing to sleep. Their faces softened, the furrows between brows temporarily smoothed by profound rest. Ruth experienced a mental quieting, not forced silencing of thought but a natural settling, like sediment gradually descending through water until clarity remains. Her thoughts, which normally raced like frantic messengers, now moved with the unhurried rhythm of gentle waves reaching shore. Your mind will return to activity, Jesus said, but it need not return to anxiety. When thoughts arise that disturb your peace, simply bring them to me. Cast your anxieties upon me, for I care for you. As the night deepened, Jesus continued teaching in progressively softer tones. Remember that peace is not the product of perfect circumstances but of perfect trust. Not the fruit of having all answers but of knowing the one who does. The gentle invitation, come unto me and rest. As Jesus' teaching on trust settled over the gathering like evening dew, his countenance shifted subtly, his eyes reflecting ancient wisdom about the sacred nature of human rest. The transition was nearly imperceptible, like the gradual deepening of twilight into night, yet the atmosphere around the hillside transformed. One by one, members of the assembly yielded to a profound stillness. Children who had been fidgeting earlier now slumbered peacefully in their parents' embrace. Elderly listeners leaned against each other, their breathing slow and synchronized with the gentle rhythm of the nearby waters. Throughout the assembly, eyelids grew heavy as Jesus' words about perfect trust continued to resonate in the night air. The natural amphitheater had become a sanctuary of collective tranquility. Ruth observed this transformation with a mixture of wonder and resistance, feeling herself being drawn towards sleep yet struggling against it. A peculiar tension arose within her, the profound drowsiness enveloping her consciousness conflicted with her determination to remain fully present. I can't sleep now, she thought, fighting against the heaviness in her limbs. Not when I'm here, not when he's speaking. She recognized her contradiction. In a moment devoted to teachings about rest, she actively resisted the very surrender being offered. Why do I always resist what I most need? Jesus seemed to perceive this internal struggle in Ruth and several others who maintained their vigilance despite evident exhaustion. His voice took on a new quality as he addressed them directly, becoming softer yet somehow more penetrating, like water finding the smallest fissures in stone. Come to me, he invited, his tone imbued with tender authority, all who labor and are heavy laden, and I will give you rest. The simplicity of these words carried a gravitational pull. Ruth felt tears forming in response to their profound welcome. This was an acknowledgement of the universal human experience of weariness while offering something beyond mere physical respite. Take my yoke upon you, and learn from me, Jesus continued, for I am gentle and lowly in heart, and you will find rest for your souls. The word souls lingered in the night air. Ruth contemplated how different this understanding of rest was from her contemporary conception. Modern society viewed sleep as a biological necessity, a temporary escape before returning to productivity. But Jesus spoke of something far more profound, a restoration reaching beyond physical fatigue into the deepest regions of human existence. The rest I offer, Jesus explained, his voice now carrying the gentle cadence of a lullaby, is not merely the absence of activity but the presence of peace. Not an escape from life but a restoration to life as it was meant to be lived. His hands moved expressively as he spoke, drawing imagery in the moonlight. Consider how a child falls asleep, he said, gesturing toward a small boy who had surrendered to slumber in his mother's arms. There is no striving, no effort, no technique. The child simply releases himself into the arms that hold him, trusting completely in their safety. Ruth observed the sleeping child, his face completely relaxed. In this image she saw everything she had forgotten, the complete abandon, the absolute trust, the perfect peace that comes not from effort but from relationship. How long had it been since she had known such surrender? You have made rest into labor, Jesus continued, as if reading her thoughts. You have transformed surrender into struggle. Yet true rest comes not from mastering techniques but from releasing yourself into hands greater than your own. The implications extended beyond physical sleep into a comprehensive philosophy of existence. Jesus was addressing the fundamental orientation of consciousness toward trust rather than control. When you lie down, Jesus said, his voice growing even gentler, do not take your burdens with you into the night. Release them as you release your waking consciousness. The same Father who has sustained you through the day will maintain your breath through the darkness. This daily surrender to sleep is a rehearsal for the greater surrenders of your life. As Jesus spoke, Ruth noticed him beginning to move among the gathering. With infinite tenderness, he placed his hand on the head of an elderly man whose eyes had been fighting to stay open. At the moment of contact, the man's expression softened completely, and he slipped into peaceful slumber. A young woman nearby received the same blessing, her anxious features smoothing into tranquility. This progression created a wave of deepening peace. Those still awake watched with anticipation as Jesus approached, not with fear but with yearning for his touch. Ruth found herself holding her breath as he drew nearer. In surrendering to sleep, Jesus said as he moved, his voice barely above a whisper yet perfectly audible, you practice dying to your own efforts and rising again renewed, a daily parable of resurrection. When Jesus finally stood before Ruth, time seemed to suspend itself. His eyes met hers with perfect recognition, seeing the accumulated weight of sleepless nights and relentless self-reliance she had carried. Without speaking, he extended his hand toward her head. Ruth felt no need to speak. The moment transcended language. As Jesus' hand rested on her head, a sensation of warmth radiated through her entire body like honey. The chaotic activity of her mind, the perpetual planning and analyzing, smoothed into a single awareness of being profoundly held. Peace, Jesus said simply, the word containing within it every blessing she had ever needed. Ruth's resistance dissolved completely. The distinction between surrendering to sleep and surrendering to divine care blurred into a single act of profound trust. She understood that sleep was not a state to be feared but a holy invitation to release herself completely into the care of the one who had created rest itself. The return journey, bridging worlds of sleep and wakefulness. The boundary between sacred dream and waking reality is not the impermeable barrier we imagine, but rather a permeable membrane through which divine presence can flow unimpeded. In the delicate transition from night to dawn, Ruth would discover that the peace she found in Galilee wasn't confined to the realm of sleep but was preparing to reshape her waking hours in ways she never anticipated. Beneath the star-scattered canopy of the Galilean night, the gathering had fallen silent. Bodies that had earlier been tense with anticipation now rested in various attitudes of repose, children curled against parents, elderly listeners with heads gently tilted back, young adults stretched out on woven mats they had brought. The communal experience of sacred rest had transformed the shoreline into a tableau of profound tranquility, unlike anything Ruth had witnessed in her contemporary world where sleep was pursued individually, often unsuccessfully, behind closed doors. Ruth herself had settled onto the soft sand, her consciousness hovering in that exquisite space between wakefulness and slumber where perception remains but resistance has ceased. Yet now, she began to sense a subtle shift. The solidity of the Galilean shore wavered slightly at its edges, like a reflection disturbed by gentle ripples. She recognized with a pang of reluctance that she was being called back to her apartment, back to her responsibilities, back to a world where divine presence seemed more abstract than immediate. Ruth instinctively resisted, her spirit clinging to this sacred space where anxiety had no dominion. "Must I return?" she whispered, not expecting an answer in this liminal space between worlds. To her surprise, Jesus, who had been moving among the sleeping forms of his listeners, paused and turned toward her. His expression held a gentle knowing. He approached and knelt beside her on the sand. "You carry what you have received," he said simply, his voice containing a timbre meant for a single listener rather than a gathering. "The boundary you perceive between this moment and your waking life exists more in thought than in truth." Ruth struggled to articulate her fear. "But there, in my time, everything feels so separate. God seems distant. Prayer feels like speaking into emptiness." Jesus nodded, acknowledging her experience without contradiction. "The distance is an illusion created by perception, not by reality. I am as present in your bedroom as I am on this shore. The peace you have found here does not belong to Galilee, nor to this moment in time, it belongs to the eternal now that intersects all moments." As he spoke, the sounds of gentle waves began to intermingle with the pre-dawn sounds of her apartment. These overlapping soundscapes harmonized, suggesting two worlds as different expressions of a unified reality. "How will I maintain this peace when I return to my daily anxieties?" Ruth asked, sensing her time growing short. Jesus placed his hand over hers, the warmth of his touch anchoring her momentarily between worlds. "You have been practicing surrender to sleep as a physical necessity. Now practice it as a spiritual act, a daily letting go, a regular rehearsal of release. When you lie down each night, remember that you are entrusting yourself to something larger than your consciousness. And when you wake, carry that same trust into your day." Ruth felt a profound truth transcending mere advice. He was describing a fundamental reorientation of her relationship with both sleep and wakefulness, complementary rhythms within a greater harmony. "The peace I leave with you," Jesus continued, "travels between worlds because it belongs fully to neither. It exists in the space where divine reality touches human experience. That intersection is not limited to dreams or visions, it is the underlying structure of all existence." The physical sensations of her body underwent a transformation. The warmth of the Galilean evening seamlessly became the warmth of her bed covers. The gentle pressure of sand beneath her gradually transformed into the familiar contours of her mattress. Unlike previous abrupt transitions, this metamorphosis unfolded with grace. Jesus's voice took on an echo quality, as if speaking simultaneously from the shoreline and from within her consciousness. "Remember that waking is itself a kind of birth, a daily resurrection. The ancients understood what modern minds have forgotten, that the boundary between sleeping and waking is sacred." "Will I remember this?" she asked, suddenly fearful that the profound peace would evaporate like morning mist. Jesus smiled, the expression illuminating his features even as they began to blur. "The mind may forget details, but the spirit retains transformation. What matters is not that you recall every word spoken but that you have been altered by our encounter. The peace you carry now is not a memory to preserve but a presence to recognize." As the last vestiges of the Galilean scene dissolved, Ruth experienced not a jarring dislocation but an elegant integration, her consciousness incorporating the sacred encounter into her very being. The transition completed itself with extraordinary gentleness. Ruth opened her eyes to the familiar shadows of her bedroom, illuminated by the first hint of dawn. As light breached the darkness, she recalled the psalmist's words, "I awake, and I am still with you." The phrase resonated through her consciousness, bridging ancient wisdom with her present moment of rebirth. For a moment she lay perfectly still, anticipating the return of her customary morning anxiety. Instead, she encountered a profound stillness at her core. The worries were observable at the periphery of her awareness, but they no longer constituted the gravitational center of her consciousness. Ruth drew a deep breath and realized with quiet astonishment that she felt rested in a deeper dimension she had almost forgotten existed. The peace from the Galilean shore had followed her across the threshold between worlds, not as a fading remnant but as a continuing reality. As she slowly sat up, Ruth noticed her familiar surroundings had subtly altered. Her bedroom remained unchanged, yet she experienced it differently, as if the walls that had previously seemed to separate her from the larger world had become more permeable, transparent to a presence that permeated all spaces equally. As our journey with Ruth draws to a close, we recognize that what we've witnessed is not merely an ancient story preserved in text, but a living encounter reaching into our modern bedrooms with the same gentle power that once comforted weary souls along Galilean shores. These teachings function as bridges connecting our contemporary anxieties to timeless solutions, the invitation to rest extending to each of us as a sanctuary within life's complexities. The peace Jesus offered remains accessible now as you prepare for sleep, acknowledging your struggles while providing context for transcending them. Like a steadfast flame that endures through darkness, may this ancient wisdom accompany you as consciousness yields to slumber, remaining your companion through the night and into tomorrow's light.